In the autumn of 1994, every apple grower in the Annapolis Valley had the same conversation at the end of October. They talked about yields and spray costs and the price the packing house was offering, and they agreed, more or less, that the numbers were getting tighter every year and that the only answer was to spray earlier, spray harder, and hope the weather cooperated. This was not a plan. It was not even a decision, not really. It was the accumulated weight of 30 years of the same choices producing the same results. And in the Annapolis Valley in 1994, the same results were what most growers had come to expect. Not good. Not profitable in the way that profitability gets discussed at farm kitchen tables after the children are in bed, but survivable. And survivable had been the standard that the valley had measured itself against for a long time. Let me tell you what survivable looked like in those years, because you need to understand what Evelyn Marsh was walking into before you can understand what she did to it. A typical apple operation in Kings County, Nova Scotia, in the mid-1990s ran somewhere between 40 and 100 acres of managed orchard, mostly Macintosh and Cortland, with some Gravenstein on the older blocks, planted in the high-density European style that the Extension Office had been pushing since the 1970s. The trees were sprayed on a calendar schedule. Every 10 to 14 days from green tip through harvest, the spray rig went through the rows, regardless of what insects were doing, regardless of what the weather had been, regardless of whether the pest pressure in that particular block on that particular week justified the cost of the chemical and the fuel and the hours on the tractor. The schedule said spray. So you sprayed. The logic was straightforward. The cost of losing a crop to codling moth or apple scab was higher than the cost of the spray program. So you ran the program, all of it, every year. And you considered the cost a fixed feature of the business the same way you considered the cost of pruning or picking. Nobody had given the growers of the Annapolis Valley a reason to think differently. The spray programs worked. Not efficiently, not in the way that word gets used by people who study input costs and output ratios, but they worked in the sense that most orchards most years produced a marketable crop. The trees came through, the packing house bought the fruit, the debt got serviced. The cycle repeated. Evelyn Marsh sat on 62 acres in the Habitant area of Kings County, about 8 miles east of Kentville. Her father, Leonard Marsh, had planted the original blocks in 1968 and expanded in 1979, and he had run the orchard the way every orchard in the valley was run on schedule, with a spray record book that documented every application going back to 1971 in his small, careful handwriting. Leonard was a patient man, deliberate. He had never once, in 26 years of growing apples, gone off the calendar without a reason he could write down. He considered the spray program an obligation, like paying the mortgage. You did not skip a mortgage payment because the month had gone well. You did not skip a spray application because the weather looked clear. You ran the program because the program was what kept the orchard alive. Let me tell you about Evelyn Marsh, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is unlike almost every character this channel has ever told you about. Evelyn was 51 years old in the spring of 1995. She had not gone to university. She had not come home from an agricultural college with a stack of research papers and a yellow legal pad full of diagrams. What she had done, starting in 1988 when her husband had left, and she had taken over the operational management of the orchard from her aging father, was read. She subscribed to the Good Fruit Grower. She subscribed to the New England Fruit Meeting proceedings. She read anything the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture put out about integrated pest management, a phrase she had first encountered in 1989, and which she had been turning over in her mind ever since. She was not loud about what she was thinking. She was not the kind of person who announced herself at the co-op or at the Fruit Growers Association meetings. She listened. She wrote things in the margins of the publications she received. She had a habit of underlining sentences twice when they confirmed something she had already suspected, and there were a great many doubly underlined sentences in the issues she had accumulated in the cabinet beside the wood stove in the farmhouse kitchen. The thing Evelyn had been reading about and thinking about since 1989 was a system called Integrated Pest Management, IPM for short, and more specifically a version of it developed for tree fruit operations that replaced calendar-based spraying with a monitoring-based approach. The principle was not complicated, though its implications were substantial. Instead of spraying every 10 to 14 days regardless of conditions, you monitored the orchard. You used pheromone traps to track codling moth flight activity. You checked scab forecasting models that correlated temperature and leaf wetness with infection risks, scouted blocks weekly for mite populations and aphid presence, and you sprayed only when monitoring data indicated that pest or disease pressure had crossed an economic threshold, the point at which the expected crop damage from not spraying would exceed the cost of the spray application itself. The research behind the approach was not new. Cornell University had been publishing on it since the mid-1970s. Michigan State had a well-documented program, and in 1992, Agriculture Canada had begun a pilot program through the Kentville Research Station that had been quietly running on 8 demonstration farms in the valley, producing data that had not yet made its way into the conversations at the spray suppliers or the co-op lunch counter, but that Evelyn had been following in the station's extension bulletins, with the careful attention of a woman who suspects she is watching something important happen in slow motion. She had done the math for her own operation. The Marsh Orchard was running a spray program that cost approximately $340 per acre per year in materials alone, not counting fuel, equipment wear, and the hours she and her one seasonal employee put into running the rig. On 62 acres, that was just over $21,000 a year in spray costs. The Agriculture Canada pilot data, which she had read 3 times and then read again, suggested that a well-run IPM program on comparable Nova Scotia tree fruit operations was achieving reductions in spray applications of between 30 and 45%, with no statistically significant difference in marketable yield when the monitoring program was run correctly. A 40% reduction in spray costs on the Marsh Orchard was $8,400 a year. That was not a marginal improvement. That was the difference between an operation that was barely servicing its debt and one that might, in a normal weather year, actually put money aside. She brought this to the kitchen table in February of 1995. Leonard Marsh listened to his daughter for what she later estimated was 20 minutes without saying a word. He looked at the extension bulletins. He looked at the column of numbers she had written on the back of an envelope. He looked at the summary of the Kentville pilot data she had highlighted in yellow and clipped to the top of the stack. He picked up the envelope. He put it down. He looked out the kitchen window at the dormant orchard, the trees gray and bare in the February light, the rows running down toward the dike land. 8 orchards, he said finally. In the pilot, 8, she said, over 3 seasons. He was quiet again for a long time. Which blocks are you thinking about? She told him. The 2 Cortland blocks on the east side of the property, 24 acres, the blocks she considered the most consistent in terms of pest pressure and the easiest to monitor given their layout. He looked at the window again. Run it on those blocks, he said. 1 season. Keep your records. She said she would. Now let me tell you about the man who made certain that as many people as possible heard about Leonard Marsh's daughter and her ideas about not spraying, because no story like this one arrives without someone who encounters an unfamiliar idea and reaches for ridicule before he reaches for curiosity. His name was Gerald Wickham. He was 63 years old in 1995, and he had been the primary sales representative for Valley Orchard Supplies in Coldbrook for 19 years, having come up through the company from the warehouse floor in 1976 when he was still in his mid-40s and had decided that selling inputs to growers suited him better than growing himself, which he had tried for 6 years in Hants County, before concluding that the margins were not what the brochures had suggested. Gerald Wickham was not a dishonest man. He was not a malicious man. He was a man who had spent nearly 2 decades building his authority on the fact that he knew every serious grower in the valley, knew their soils and their varieties and their pest histories, and who had accumulated through those years of daily contact with the people who ran the orchards an absolute and unshakable certainty that he understood how apple growing in Nova Scotia worked. He held court at the supplier counter most mornings, and his opinions on spray timing carried the kind of weight that accumulates not from being correct more often than others, but from having been in the same room saying the same things for long enough that people have stopped checking. Evelyn made the necessary mistake of stopping at Valley Orchard Supplies in March of 1995 to pick up pheromone traps and monitoring supplies, the lures and the delta traps and the sticky inserts she needed to begin tracking codling moth flight in the Cortland blocks. She was not making an announcement. She needed supplies, but Gerald Wickham asked her what she was setting up, and she told him. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. "Evelyn," he said, and his tone had in it the particular patience of someone explaining a thing they consider self-evident. "You're going to hang a handful of cardboard traps in your trees and watch moths fly into them, and you're going to skip your cover sprays based on what you see." She confirmed that was roughly the idea. "And you think the moths are going to give you enough warning?" "The threshold data from the Kentville station suggests—" "I know what the Kentville station suggests," he said. "I also know what happens to a crop when you miss a codling moth generation. You lose it. Not part of it. You lose it." He looked at the man standing beside the counter, a grower named Owen Boudreau who ran about 50 acres on the Habitant Ridge. And Owen Boudreau looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who finds himself adjacent to a disagreement he did not start. "You're going to end up with wormy apples and a packing house rejection, and a very expensive lesson." Evelyn looked at Gerald Wickham for a moment. Her expression, by her own account, did not change. The 8 farms in the Agriculture Canada pilot ran monitored programs for 3 seasons, she said. None of them had a crop failure attributable to the monitoring approach. 2 of them had better clean fruit percentages than their calendar spray controls. "Those were demonstration farms," Gerald said, "with Agriculture Canada people checking the traps every other day." "I'm checking them every other day," she said. "I'll take the traps," she said. "And 24 lures." She loaded her truck and drove home. Let me pause here, because I think what just happened at that counter is worth sitting with for a moment before we go further. Gerald Wickham had 19 years of experience selling inputs to the growers of the Annapolis Valley. He was not wrong that he had seen a great many ideas come through that door and fail. He was not wrong that there were real risks in any approach that reduced spray coverage in an orchard under genuine pest pressure. What he could not see from behind that counter was that his 19 years of experience were 19 years of watching the same calendar-based system operate under the same assumptions, with the same inputs, producing the same results. He had never seen a well-run IPM program on a Valley apple operation because nobody in his orbit had ever run one. His certainty was built not on evidence that the approach failed, but on the absence of evidence that it worked locally. On ground, he recognized the absence of a local example is not the same as proof of impossibility. Evelyn Marsh understood that. Gerald Wickham did not. Let me tell you about the spring and summer of 1995, because the monitoring season on the Cortland blocks is where the story begins to turn. Evelyn installed the pheromone traps in the last week of April as the trees were coming into pink. She placed them at the standard density, 1 trap per 5 acres, checking them every 48 hours, and recording moth catches in a notebook she kept in the pocket of her canvas jacket. She subscribed to the Nova Scotia Weather Network's Degree Day Accumulation Service, a fax-based system run out of the Kentville station that gave her daily updates on codling moth development based on temperature data from the weather station closest to her orchard. And she began checking for apple scab infection periods using the Mills table method, correlating the daily temperature and leaf wetness hours she recorded from a simple rain gauge and thermometer mounted on a post at the orchard edge. The first thing she noticed, in the 3rd week of May, was that her monitoring data was telling her something different from the calendar. The calendar said, first cover spray, 10 to 14 days after petal fall. The pheromone traps on that same date were catching 4 moths per trap per week. The economic threshold for codling moth in the Agriculture Canada guidelines was 15 moths per trap per week, before the first generation was considered economically significant. Her trees were at 4. The calendar program would have had her spray. The monitoring program said wait. She waited. She checked the traps 2 days later. 6 moths. She waited again. 9. On the 3rd check, 14 moths, just below threshold, with degree day accumulation suggesting that first-generation egg hatch was still 4 to 5 days away. She sprayed 11 days after the calendar program would have told her to. The second thing she noticed, starting in June, was what was happening in the trees. She was not spraying on schedule. The mite populations, specifically the European red mite, which in a calendar program gets hit incidentally by broad-spectrum insecticides whether the population warrants it or not, were being suppressed in the monitored blocks by predatory mite populations that had no business surviving in an orchard running a full calendar program, but that were establishing themselves in the Cortland blocks because the spray pressure had been reduced enough to let them. She was seeing biological control, not as a philosophy, not as an intention, but as a consequence of giving the system enough room to function. She wrote it down. By August, she had data she could look at clearly. The Cortland blocks had received 6 spray applications since petal fall. The Leonard blocks, the McIntosh and Gravenstein running on the standard calendar program under her father's oversight had received 9 applications on the same period. The Cortland blocks were running at lower per acre spray cost by a margin she calculated at 38%, and the trees, when she walked them in late August and assessed fruit on a random sample of 100 trees per block, were carrying a clean fruit percentage she estimated at 92. The packing house standard for a premium grade was 88. She did not say anything to Leonard yet. She wanted the harvest numbers. In October, when the Cortland blocks came off and went through the grader at the packing house, the numbers were unambiguous. The monitored blocks had returned 91.4% premium grade fruit. The McIntosh blocks on the calendar program had returned 88.7%, consistent with the Marsh Orchard's 5-year average. On a per-acre revenue basis, accounting for the grade premium and the lower spray cost, the monitored Cortland blocks had outperformed the calendar blocks by $212 per acre. On 24 acres, that was just over $5,000 in additional net margin. The total spend on the monitoring program, traps, lures, The Weather Service subscription and the additional scouting time she had logged had come to $840. She put the numbers on paper and brought them to the kitchen table in November. Leonard Marsh looked at the greater tickets. He looked at the spray record comparison. He picked up her notebook and read through the moth trap data, slowly, the way a man reads something he wants to make sure he is understanding correctly. He set it down. "You sprayed 6 times," he said. "6," she said. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Ruth Marsh, Evelyn's mother, who had been drying dishes at the sink and had not said a word, set her towel down and turned around. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Leonard. Leonard picked up the greater tickets again. He looked at the premium percentage. He set them down again. "Give me the east side," he said finally. "All of it. Next season." The east side was the other half of the Marsh orchard, 38 acres. Evelyn said that was fine. "Let me tell you about Gerald Wickham and the conversation that happened at the co-op counter in October of 1995, because it is the conversation that turned a private experiment into something the Valley could not ignore." Owen Boudreau, who had been standing at the counter the morning Evelyn collected her traps, had a son named Matthew who worked part-time at the Kentville Co-op while he figured out whether he wanted to stay in farming. Matthew Boudreau mentioned, as people mention things in small counties, that Leonard Marsh's daughter had finished the season on her Cortland blocks without a full calendar program, and that the greater tickets apparently did not show it. This reached Gerald Wickham before the end of the month. Gerald Wickham had a theory. It was about the Cortland variety specifically, which was known in the Valley for being somewhat less susceptible to codling moth pressure than Macintosh. It was about the particular location of the east blocks, which had the benefit of good air drainage and historically lower disease pressure than the heavier soils. To the west, there was how one season was not a trend and one operation was not a study. This theory circulated through the co-op counter conversations through October and into November, with the persistence that theories acquire when they are serving a purpose, which was to allow the men who held them to continue believing what they had always believed without having to look at the greater tickets. The summer of 1996 did not cooperate with the theory. Let me tell you about the summer of 1996, because that summer is the reason this story is still being told. The pressure year came not from drought, but from rain. The summer of 1996 was wet in the Annapolis Valley in the way that wet summers damage apple orchards. Not flooding, not a single catastrophic event, but a persistent pattern of morning fog and afternoon cloud and rainfall events spaced close enough together through June and July that scab infection periods were running almost continuously for 11 weeks. By mid-July, orchards that had not kept ahead of their scab programs were showing secondary infections in the canopy, a spread that, once it establishes, cannot be sprayed out of an orchard. You can protect new growth, you cannot cure infected tissue. Secondary scab in July in a wet year means a crop with cosmetic damage that the packing house grades down or rejects. In a bad enough infection year, it means a crop you cannot sell at premium prices at all. The calendar program orchards in Kings County ran through the wet spring the same way they always ran. They were on schedule, but the schedule had been built for a normal year with normal infection periods, and what 1996 presented was not a normal year. Several operations that had stuck to their standard 10 to 14-day intervals found themselves caught between applications when a 4-day leaf witness event in the third week of June produced an infection period that the calendar, by its nature, could not account for. Don Hebert, who ran 70 acres south of Berwick, lost 30% of his Cortland crop to secondary scab infection. He had never missed an application. He had simply not been watching what the weather was doing between applications. The calendar had not given him a reason to. Evelyn's operation ran differently that summer. The Mills table data she was tracking told her that the infection periods in June were stacking in a way the calendar could not accommodate. She sprayed on June 14th, which was not a calendar day, because the infection period data told her the risk was high. She sprayed again on June 19th, which was also not a calendar day, for the same reason. In July, when the rain continued, she added 2 additional applications that the calendar program would not have included. Her total spray count by the end of August was 9 applications. The calendar program growers had applied 8 or 9 as well, but hers were timed to infection periods. Theirs were timed to the calendar. In October, when the Marsh orchard came off and went through the packing house grader, the premium grade percentage on the monitored blocks was 93.1%. It was the highest single-season result the Marsh orchard had recorded in 20 years of grader tickets. On the calendar blocks that Leonard had kept under his own management through August before handing them to Evelyn in September, the premium percentage was 87.4, which was acceptable, but which was achieved at a higher per-application cost because the calendar program had not directed any of those applications toward the actual infection events. She had not cut corners. She had not reduced her spray count below what the pest pressure warranted. What she had done was spray when the data told her to spray rather than when the calendar told her to, and in a year when the calendar was wrong, the data was right. The per-acre net margin on the monitored blocks in 1996, accounting for spray cost and grade premium, came in at $287 above the calendar average for the valley, as reported in the Fruit Growers Association annual summary. On the 62 acres she was now monitoring across the full orchard, the difference in net margin represented roughly $17,800 in a single season. She did not call the newspaper. She did not write to the Kentville station. She drove to the Fruit Growers Association office in Coldbrook and sat down with the field rep, a man named Paul Arsenault, who had been quietly watching the Marsh operation since 1995 and who had questions he had been saving. She answered his questions for an hour and a half. She left him with a copy of her spray records, her monitoring logs, and the grader tickets from both seasons. Paul Arsenault published a summary of the Marsh orchard data in the association's winter newsletter in January of 1997. It ran 4 pages. It included the spray cost comparisons, the grade premium data, the infection period logs from 1996, and a description of the monitoring approach with enough detail that a grower who had been thinking about it could use it as a starting point. Let me tell you about the morning in March of 1997 when Gerald drove out to the Marsh farm. Because that morning is where accounts get settled. He came in his company truck, arriving around 8:30 on a Tuesday morning when the last of February's snow was still in the orchard rows and the trees were still dormant, their bare branches holding the pale light of a Nova Scotia March. Evelyn was in the equipment shed, checking the spray rig for the coming season, replacing a nozzle body that had cracked in the cold. She heard the truck and came out to find Gerald Wickham standing in the yard, looking at the Cortland blocks on the east side. She had not spoken with him directly since the morning she had collected her traps. He looked older than she remembered. Though it had only been 2 years, there was something in the way he was standing, one hand resting on the hood of the truck and his eyes on the bare trees, that reminded her of a man reading a balance sheet he already knew was against him. "I read Arsenault's piece," he said. Evelyn waited. "The 1996 numbers," he said. "The scab data. Paul verified it against the grader tickets," she said. "The lab from Agriculture Canada confirmed the infection period logs." He nodded slowly. He kept looking at the trees. "I told you you'd lose a crop without a full calendar program," he said. He said it quietly, without the confidence that had been in his voice at the counter in 1995. He said it like a man closing a file he no longer knew how to defend. "You did," Evelyn said. "That's not what happened." "No," she said, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. A gray jay landed in one of the Cortland trees and looked at them both and flew off. "I've got 6 growers asking me about pheromone traps," Gerald Wickham said. "Since Arsenault's newsletter, they want to know how to set up the monitoring, where to start." He paused. "I don't know what to tell them." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. She was not angry. If she had ever been angry, she had spent 2 seasons working it out of her system, one monitoring notebook at a time. "Tell them to start with the trap density recommendations from the Kentville station," she said. "1 trap per 5 acres delta style, hung at eye level in the mid-canopy. Check them every 48 hours. Keep the records. The data tells you when to spray. You have to trust the data more than you trust the calendar." She paused. "The calendar is a guess. A reasonable guess most years. But a guess. The monitoring tells you what's actually happening in your trees." Gerald Wickham looked at her. He nodded once. "Could you come and talk to those 6 growers?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I can do that. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the Cortland blocks were the proof of concept, and the full orchard conversion was where the story became something larger. By the spring of 1998, Evelyn was running the full IPM monitoring program across all 62 acres of the Marsh orchard. With Leonard accompanying her on the Tuesday scouting rounds, the green ledger book he had kept since 1971 retired to the shelf beside the wood stove and replaced by the monitoring notebook system Evelyn had developed. 1 notebook per block per season. The spray costs across the orchard had dropped by 41% from the 1994 baseline. The premium grade percentage had averaged 92.6 over the 3 monitored seasons. The per-acre net margin improvement was running at $240 above the regional calendar average, confirmed in 2 successive years by the association's independent summary. The 6 growers who had asked Gerald Wickham about monitoring traps came out to the Marsh orchard in April of 1997. Evelyn walked them through the trap placement, explained the Mills table method, showed them the monitoring notebooks, and answered their questions for most of an afternoon. All 6 installed monitoring programs that spring. By the fall of 1997, all 6 had reduced their spray counts by between 3 and 5 applications without a statistically significant change in their packing house results. Word moved the way word moves in Kings County. Through the co-op, through the Federation meetings, through the conversations after church, in the apple-grown communities along the ridge roads. By 1999, 31 operations in the Annapolis Valley were running some form of monitoring-based IPM program. By 2001, the Agriculture Canada station had incorporated the Marsh Orchard data into its regional IPM guidelines and was citing it in the training materials it distributed to new growers. Paul Arsenault presented the valley-wide adoption data at the Nova Scotia Fruit Growers Association annual meeting in Truro in 2000. He gave Evelyn Marsh's name as the source of the original field data. She was in the room. She was 56 years old, and she was wearing her canvas jacket, and she had, Leonard said afterward, the same expression on her face she had worn the night she first brought the numbers to the kitchen table. Careful, waiting to see if the numbers held. When Paul Arsenault said her name and the room began to applaud, she looked at the table in front of her. Leonard Marsh was beside her. He put his hand flat on the table, just beside her hand. He did not say anything. Leonard Marsh had never been a man who found words easily, and by 2000, he had found even fewer than before, his health beginning the slow retreat that would take most of the following decade. but he put his hand beside hers on that table in Truro and left it there until the applause had finished. She understood what he meant. Let me tell you about the last thing, because this story has one more turn, and it happens in the Marsh farmhouse kitchen in the spring of 2003. Evelyn was 59 years old. She had been running the full operation for 11 years, with Leonard in an advisory role that had suited him far better than the daily physical work since his first cardiac event in 1998. The orchard was producing at levels the 1994 Marsh Ledger book could not have projected. 62 acres under monitoring, spray costs running at a sustained 40% below the regional calendar average, soil health in the oldest blocks improving in ways that the Kentville Station's soil monitoring program had been documenting since 1999, and a reputation that had brought growers from Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick to walk the blocks in August and ask Evelyn questions she answered without drama. At supper one evening in April, Evelyn's daughter Claire, who was 26, and had been helping with the scouting program for 3 seasons while she decided whether she wanted to stay in Nova Scotia and farm or move west, put a stack of printouts on the table. The printouts were from a research group at Dalhousie University's Faculty of Agriculture, which had moved to Truro, and they described a new system for tracking beneficial insect populations in apple orchards using acoustic monitoring technology, small vibration sensors attached to the bark of sample trees that could detect the feeding activity of predatory insects and give real-time data on biological control establishment. Claire said she thought it was worth looking at. She said the research group was looking for trial orchards. Evelyn picked up the printouts. She read the abstract. She looked at the figures. She thought about February of 1995 and a kitchen table and a column of numbers on an envelope, and her father looking out the window at the dormant orchard and finally saying, "Give me 1 season." She thought about the Cortland blocks in August of 1995 with the predatory mites establishing a canopy and the monitoring notebook filling with entries that confirmed something she had not set out to prove but that the data had shown her anyway. She set the printouts down. She looked at her daughter. "Call the research group," she said. "Tell them we'll trial it." She did not ask for a season to think it over. Leonard Marsh was at the table. He heard the exchange. He said nothing. But later that evening, when Evelyn was washing the supper dishes, she heard him in the kitchen behind her, and when she turned around, he had the green ledger book down from the shelf beside the wood stove, the one from 1971 that had been sitting there for 9 years unused. And he had it open on the table, and he was writing in it. Just 1 line. She did not read what it said until after he died in 2006. It said, in his small, careful handwriting, "C knows how to watch. Some things you learn the hard way, and some things you learn from someone who already paid that cost and was patient enough to show you what they found." Evelyn Marsh had paid it in seasons, in monitoring notebooks and spray records, and 2 years of standing behind data while the co-op counter discussed her theories. She had paid it well enough that when her daughter set a stack of printouts on the kitchen table, Evelyn did not look out the window. She picked up the phone. The Cortland blocks on the east side of the Marsh property are still monitored on the original 5-acre trap density. The full orchard runs the program Evelyn developed between 1995 and 1998. Updated now with the acoustic sensors the Dalhousie Group helped install in 2004 and the degree-day modeling software the Kentville Station has been refining ever since. The monitoring notebooks, 1 per block per season, are stored in a cabinet in the farmhouse kitchen. Evelyn's handwriting and Claire's, season by season, running in the same cabinet where Leonard's green ledger book lived for 30 years. Gerald Wickham retired in 2004. At his last regional fruit growers meeting, he told anyone who asked that the best thing that had happened to input sales in the valley over the previous decade was that fewer inputs were being used per acre, because the growers who were doing it right were staying in business and buying supplies for longer. He did not say where he had first understood that. He did not need to. The 6 growers who had called him after Arsenault's newsletter were in the room. They knew. She hung pheromone traps in an orchard full of people who sprayed by the calendar. She skipped applications when the data said the pressure wasn't there. They said she would lose her crop. The wet summer came. The calendar programs caught secondary scab in July. The monitored blocks did not. The notebooks kept filling. The spray costs kept dropping. And the lesson that a 51-year-old woman with a canvas jacket and a rain gauge wrote into a monitoring notebook in the habitant district of Kings County in the spring of 1995 is still being taught, one trap check at a time, in orchards that finally learned to watch before they spray.